For Douglas, if I may, Professor Pratt, religious populism can be found in most religions. Many different religions in the world with entirely different belief systems have experienced and continue to experience a version of populism. Now, to combat growing religious populism, do you think it's possible that all religions could collaborate? Or are there irreconcilable differences across the religions that would prevent any such collaboration? Professor?
Thank you, George, and kia ora, everyone from New Zealand. Collaboration between religions implies some form of dialogue of action, as we call it, and that by definition means some kind of dialogical relationship. And for that, there needs to be an engagement, at least on the basis of a measure of equality, of acceptance and respect. Not necessarily agreement, but certainly acceptance. There certainly needs to be an accord of values, no necessary requirement to believe in the truth that each religion professes, but certainly, as I say, to accept that we are people who do profess. So what is needed is recognition and acknowledgement of the meaning and significance of belief systems for the believers in order then for action to take place. On that basis, there's no irreconcilable difference to prevent collaboration, because it goes beyond the questions of the truth and falsity of beliefs and that kind of thing, which can be the basis for discord. So I think where collaboration is certainly feasible. It does happen at certain practical levels, and there's no reason why it couldn't be drawn upon in order to combat the vagaries of what we're calling religious populism.
Let's go back to Professor Pratt. Douglas, populism and violence are closely linked. However, with religious populism, violence is justified using religious beliefs, and it allows religious populist groups to actually enlist soldiers, as we've seen over the last few years, and as we've seen during the recent attacks, quite violent attacks in Christchurch, in Afghanistan, and other parts of the world. Now, is there a difference to the level of violence when populism takes on this religious label?
The short answer to your question is yes. That where you have political and social extremism or violence enacted, if it's under the umbrella of a religious sensibility, then yes, it knows no limits really. We've seen plenty of examples of that. I was mentioning that Tarrant in Christchurch in 2019 was not himself a religious populist. He was more a white supremacist, though he drew on his manifesto, drew on some of the rhetoric of that kind of religious populism. But more interestingly, in Christchurch, you had, after the terrorism event, a particular right-wing Christian group, the Destiny Church, which staged a Jesus rally in close proximity of the Al Noor Mosque. In it, they were taking aim quite clearly at Muslims and at Islam. And that, for me, is a kind of a situation where you have building up before a violent act takes place, is this ramping up of aggressive rhetoric and allied activity that dehumanizes and belittles the target. Another example that which Greg just mentioned, of course, is Trump. His instrumentalizing of religion, as he did earlier this year, waving some time ago, waving that Bible up as he gathered support around him, which clearly fed into January storming of the Capitol in Washington. Now that's yet to be uncovered fully, but the indications are pretty clear. It's another example of religion being intertwined with these kind of right-wing politicizations. And another one, of course, is what we saw earlier this century with the rise of ISIS and its own appealing propaganda, its own attractive propaganda that drew in particularly young people, disaffected young people, young Muslim people from around the world into it. And then from that flowed, quite tremendous violence. So you have that quite clear juxtaposition of populist religious sensibility, mentality, rhetoric, and so on, that becomes very appealing, and then somehow lessens the breaks we have that prevent us from normally doing extremely bad things. And you take the break off and these bad things happen.
Douglas, if I may, Professor Pratt, religious populism or religious populist discourse can take a rather apocalyptic tone sometimes. We see religious groups and or figures advertised as the so-called fulfillment of prophecies. We have recent examples for you when a number of evangelist pastors compared the former US President Donald Trump to ancient Persia's King Cyrus, who rescued the Jewish people from captivity in the Bible. And then, of course, there's the other example, the recent example of the Turkish President Erdogan, who has been regarded by some to be the commander who will actually fight Christian and Jewish adversaries at the end of time. How does one actually prevent such a dangerous misinterpretation of the sacred text?
That's an incredibly good question, really, the question of text, their interpretation and misinterpretation. There's basically two answers. The short answer is the pessimistic one, is that there's no way of preventing misinterpretation. People will misinterpret. The other answer, though, is a bit more positive, and that is it implies the need in our day and our age for an increased attention being paid to religious education. I mean proper religious education, religious studies, where if you like, the analogy I use is something like this. We are not medical specialists. I don't think you are. I'm certainly not a medical specialist. But I do have an understanding of medicine and how the medical world works by virtue of being just an educated human being in society, and who goes to a doctor and who gets prescriptions and that kind of stuff. In other words, most of us have a degree of medical literacy so that we can function in society in terms of using doctors, hospitals, chemists, whatever. But unfortunately, that's not the case when it comes to religion. And when it comes to the entwinement of religion and society and politics in the way that we're discussing here. And so as a result, you have on the one hand remarks like, well, you know, when it comes to a text, just whatever you think it means is what it means. What it means to you is what it means. So is there any objective way of actually assessing interpretation versus misinterpretation? Now, I'd argue that there is across all texts. And the first thing, of course, is to understand that texts aren't oracles, and they are all subject to interpretation, and all interpretation requires a lens. And what is the lens that people bring to their reading of a text that enables them to interpret and apply it is the key question. And so that, one of the biggest errors, if you like, of so-called fundamentalism or literalism is that you can simply take a religious text and read it as you're reading an instruction manual for your television or your car or something, which I believe is actually more complicated. But however, you read the text and it'll tell you what to do, and so on. Whereas religious texts are not like that at all. They require interpretation to understand. The poetic language is often poetic, it's indirect, and so on and so forth. So, and then you have, of course, the phenomenon, one of the phenomena which is brought into this kind of context of reading text is, as you indicated, reading the signs and aligning what someone said back then as a prophecy for what's happening now. And that's a popular kind of maneuver that people use, so that they then try and say, aha, so-and-so is this, that means that, and now we must go and thump them, whatever. So the question of authentic interpretation of text is a vital issue, all right, within all religious communities. And I think actually I would want to suggest also within the non-religious community, with people who are not of a particular religion, simply to understand how texts function, so that you're not taken in by this notion that somehow it's just a manual to do X, Y, and Z.
I was just going to say, Douglas, is there a connection between jihadism and popular religious discourse? And this is part of our wrap-up now, because we've done tremendously well to answer so many questions in the allotted time. So I'm almost giving you the opportunity to wrap it up on behalf of the academics.
Well, I think yes, there is, insofar as if by popular religious discourse we mean that kind of discourse around religion which hardens the sense of identity and belonging and creates more exclusivity, and the us and them divides. I mean, we've seen it not only between religions but very particularly within religious communities, how those divides can play out. And so the warring jihadist perspective, because mustn't forget that jihad is more than just violence or warfare. It's actually much broader than that. But focusing on the military and political type of struggle, it's for the supremacy of those who hold a particular view as being absolutely correct and wishing to impose it on their fellows, whether it's their fellows within their own religious community or beyond. And that's a mark of religious extremism. So in the end, I think popular religious discourse and jihadic tendencies, whether you think of that in terms of Muslim jihad or other forms of militarized, aggressive sort of imposition in other communities, it's the same basic thing.